The stranger in the shadows. The rhythmic sound of a basketball bouncing against the driveway broke the peaceful monotony of a spring afternoon in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Jonathan, a lanky 12-year-old with sandy brown hair and a determined glint in his eye, practiced his dribbling beneath the hoop mounted on the garage. The warmth of the sun soaked into his skin as birds chirped in the maple trees lining the street. Jonathan had been out there for over an hour, perfecting his crossover dribble and working on his laves. His dream of making the school basketball team fueled his every move. Just as he prepared to attempt another shot, a peculiar sensation crept over him, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. He stopped mid-dribble and glanced around, his heart thudding faintly in his chest. Across the street, partially obscured by the thick trunk of a maple tree, stood a small figure. It was a girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, wearing a plain blue dress. Her dark hair was neatly braided, and she was barefoot despite the chill that lingered in the spring air. Jonathan's stomach did an uncomfortable flip. The way she stood there, silent and unmoving, unsettled him. He offered a tentative wave, hoping to ease the awkwardness, but she didn't respond. Instead, she kept watching him with eyes that seemed far too sad for someone her age. Trying to shake the unease, Jonathan resumed dribbling. But every time he glanced up, she was still there, her presence as constant as the shadow cast by the tree. He missed more shots than usual that day, his focus split between the basketball hoop and the quiet observer across the street. When the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Jonathan finally gathered his ball and headed inside. But before he opened the front door, he stole one last look. The girl hadn't moved. She stood rooted to the same spot, her somber gaze following him until he disappeared into the house. Over the next few days, the girl became an unexpected fixture in Jonathan's life. He saw her everywhere. She appeared at the park, sitting on a bench with her hands folded neatly in her lap. She showed up near the school crossing, lingering near the crossing guard, but never approaching anyone. Once, he even spotted her standing near the grocery store, her small frame blending into the background of bustling shoppers. Each time their eyes met, the girl would quickly look away, as though embarrassed to be caught staring. Yet she never came closer or spoke a single word. Jonathan's unease grew with each encounter. At first, he tried to convince himself it was all a coincidence, but the pattern was undeniable. She wasn't just randomly appearing. She was following him. "Do you see her?" Jonathan whispered to his best friend, Tommy, one afternoon as they walked home from school. He nodded toward a corner where the girl stood, partially hidden by a row of mailboxes. Tommy squinted in the direction Jonathan indicated but shrugged. "I don't see anyone, dude. Are you sure you're not imagining things?" Jonathan frowned. By the time he looked back, the girl was gone. Saturday brought a rare sunny day, and Jonathan joined his friends at the park for an afternoon of baseball practice. The familiar smell of fresh-cut grass and the sound of the bat cracking against the ball usually put him at ease, but as he stepped up to bat, his gaze drifted toward the bleachers. There she was again, sitting alone in the last row. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her dark eyes fixed on him. Jonathan's palms grew clammy as he gripped the bat. He swung at the next pitch and missed entirely, earning a groan from his coach and laughter from his teammates. "Shake it off, Barrow," the coach yelled. Jonathan forced himself to focus, but the girl's presence loomed like a shadow over his game. After practice, he spotted her standing by the chain-link fence. This time, their eyes met for several seconds before she turned and walked away. Who was she? What did she want? That night, Jonathan lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. His parents had noticed his distracted behavior during dinner and asked if something was bothering him. But he couldn't bring himself to tell them about the girl. It sounded too strange, even to him. Sleep eventually claimed him, but it was restless and filled with unsettling dreams. He saw the girl standing in the rain, her blue dress soaked through as she whispered something he couldn't hear. Jonathan jolted awake in the middle of the night, his heart pounding. He pushed the dream aside, telling himself it was nothing, just his imagination. Yet, the unease lingered. Sunday arrived with gray skies and a steady drizzle. Jonathan was helping his mother bake cookies in the kitchen when he glanced out the window and froze. The girl was standing in the driveway, drenched from head to toe. Her dress clung to her small frame, and her braids dripped with rainwater. She looked fragile, like a porcelain doll left out in a storm. "Mom," Jonathan said, his voice trembling. "She's out there." His mother followed his gaze and gasped. Without hesitation, she grabbed a towel and rushed to the front door. Jonathan followed close behind, his pulse racing. The girl flinched as Mrs. Barrow opened the door, but she didn't move away. Her lips were blue from the cold, and she shivered violently. "Oh, sweetheart," Mrs. Barrow said, her voice filled with concern. "Come inside. You'll catch your death out here." The girl hesitated, her wide eyes darting between Mrs. Barrow and Jonathan. After a moment, she stepped over the threshold, her bare feet leaving wet footprints on the tile. Jonathan's mother wrapped the towel around the girl's shoulders and guided her to the kitchen. "What's your name, honey?" she asked gently. The girl clutched the towel tightly and whispered, "Maya." Jonathan stood by the counter, watching as his mother fussed over Maya, offering her a mug of hot chocolate and a warm blanket. Up close, she looked even smaller and more fragile than she had from afar. Her eyes were haunted, filled with a sorrow that didn't belong in someone so young. "Why were you standing out in the rain, Maya?" Mrs. Barrow asked softly. "Do you have a home?" Maya stared into her mug, her hands trembling. I don't have anywhere else to go," she whispered. Jonathan felt a chill run down his spine. Maya's words hung in the air, heavy with a meaning he couldn't yet understand. Shadows of the past. The rain persisted, tapping against the kitchen window like a steady drumbeat as Maya sat wrapped in the thick blue blanket Mrs. Barrow had given her. She seemed impossibly small in the oversized chair, her damp braids still dripping slightly onto her shoulders. Her fingers clutched the edge of the blanket, as though it were the only thing tethering her to this moment of safety. Jonathan leaned against the counter, watching her with a mix of curiosity and unease. His mother moved around the kitchen with purpose, preparing a bowl of warm soup for their unexpected guest. His father, Officer Robert Barrow, had just walked in from his shift and was taking in the scene with a furrowed brow. "Maya," Mrs. Barrow said gently, placing the steaming bowl of soup in front of her. "Sweetheart, where are your parents?" Maya hesitated, her gaze flickering to Jonathan before settling on the bowl. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "My daddy. He's gone." The words hung heavy in the air. Jonathan felt a pang of guilt for all the times he'd been annoyed by her silent presence. Now, faced with the reality of her situation, he wished he'd said something sooner. "I'm so sorry, honey," Mrs. Barrow said, her voice breaking with compassion. She pulled out a chair and sat beside Maya, placing a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder. "Do you have anyone else? A family member we can call?" Maya shook her head, her grip on the blanket tightening. "There's no one," she murmured. "Daddy always said, if anything happened to him, I should find the family in the blue house on Cedar Street." Jonathan's father straightened, his eyes narrowing. "The blue house on Cedar Street," he repeated, his tone suddenly serious. Maya nodded, her dark eyes meeting his. "He said they were a police family. He said they'd keep me safe." Jonathan's mother gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. "Robert," she said, her voice trembling. Could she mean? Officer Barrow nodded slowly, his expression grim. He pulled out a chair and sat down across from Maya, leaning forward slightly. "Maya," he said, his voice kind but firm. "What was your daddy's name?" "Richard Thompson," Maya whispered, her voice cracking on the last syllable. Jonathan's father froze. The room fell into an almost tangible silence as his jaw tightened and his eyes glistened with emotion. "Richard Thompson," he repeated softly, almost to himself. "He was my partner." Jonathan's eyes widened as he looked at his father. He remembered hearing the name in passing, usually spoken in reverent tones. Officer Richard Thompson had died in the line of duty 6 months ago. His father had been quieter than usual for weeks after, but he hadn't shared much with Jonathan, only mentioning that it had been a tragic loss. "You knew my daddy?" Maya asked, her voice trembling with hope and grief. Officer Barrow nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "I did. Your dad was one of the bravest men I ever knew. He saved my life more than once." He paused, his eyes clouded with the weight of memory. "And I promised him that if anything ever happened to him, I'd look after you." Maya's lips quivered, and tears spilled down her cheeks. "He said you would," she whispered. "But when he was gone, the people came and took me away. I've been to so many houses, but no one wanted me." Jonathan's mother let out a soft cry, reaching out to gently stroke Maya's hair. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You're safe now. We're going to take care of you." That night, the Barrow family gathered in the living room. Maya sat on the couch between Mrs. Barrow and Jonathan, her small hands clutching a cup of tea. Officer Barrow sat in his recliner, the same thoughtful expression he wore when working through a tough case. "We need to notify Child Services," he said finally, his tone reluctant. "They'll need to know where she is." "No." Maya's voice rang out, panic etched across her face. She set the cup down, her hands trembling. "Please don't send me back. They'll just move me again, and no one will want me." Mrs. Barrow wrapped an arm around Maya, pulling her close. "We won't let that happen, sweetheart," she said firmly. "You're staying right here." "But how?" Jonathan asked, his brow furrowing. He was still trying to process everything. Won't the system make her go back? Officer Barrow sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. "The system isn't perfect," he admitted. "But Richard trusted us to protect Maya, and I intend to keep that promise." Over the next few days, the Barrow household adjusted to having Maya as part of their family. She was shy and quiet, but she followed Jonathan around like a shadow. At first, he found it a little annoying. He wasn't used to having someone constantly nearby. But as he watched her grow more comfortable, he realized how much she needed the sense of security. One evening, Jonathan found Maya sitting on the back porch, staring at the stars. She clutched a small silver pendant in her hand, the same one she'd worn since she arrived. "What's that?" Jonathan asked, sitting down beside her. Maya glanced at the pendant, her lips curling into a sad smile. "It's a star," she said. "My daddy gave it to me on my birthday. He said it was to remind me that even on the darkest nights, there's always a light to guide me." Jonathan nodded, looking up at the sky. "He sounds like he was a really good dad." "He was," Maya whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "He always told me to be brave, no matter what." "You are brave," Jonathan said. "You found us, didn't you? That takes guts." Maya looked at him, her eyes wide with surprise. A small smile crept onto her face, and for the first time since she'd arrived, Jonathan saw a glimmer of hope in her expression. In the weeks that followed, the Barrow family worked tirelessly to make Maya feel at home. They transformed the spare bedroom into a cozy space for her, complete with soft bedding and a nightlight shaped like a star. Mrs. Barrow taught her how to bake cookies, and Officer Barrow told her stories about her father, painting a picture of a man who was not just a hero, but a deeply caring father. Jonathan found himself growing closer to Maya in ways he hadn't expected. They played board games, read books, and even built a blanket fort in the living room one rainy afternoon. Maya's laughter, once rare and tentative, began to fill the house like sunshine breaking through the clouds. But despite the growing bond, the shadow of uncertainty loomed over them. The Barrows knew they couldn't keep Maya without going through the proper channels, and as they prepared to navigate the complexities of the legal system, they also braced themselves for the possibility that it might not be enough. For now, though, they focused on what mattered most, giving Maya the love and stability she deserved. And as she fell asleep each night in her new room, the soft glow of the star-shaped nightlight casting gentle shadows on the walls. She began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she had finally found her way home. Threads of hope. The mornings in the Barrow household had become livelier since Maya's arrival. Jonathan, who used to drag himself to the kitchen for breakfast, now made it a point to sit with Maya, chatting about what the day might bring. Maya, still a bit reserved, had started offering small smiles in return, her dark eyes slowly losing the haunted look that had greeted them on her first night. It was one such morning when the doorbell rang, interrupting their usual routine. Officer Robert Barrow, already dressed in his uniform and preparing to leave for work, exchanged a glance with his wife before heading to the door. Jonathan noticed Maya stiffen in her chair, her small hands gripping the edges of her plate. "It's probably just the mailman," Jonathan said, trying to reassure her. But when the door opened, it wasn't the mailman. It was a tall woman in a crisp blazer, holding a briefcase and wearing an expression that was both professional and mildly apologetic. "Good morning," she began. "I'm Miss Calder from Child Protective Services. I'm here regarding Maya Thompson." The Barrows had anticipated this visit, but the reality of it was still unsettling. Miss Calder sat at the dining table, her briefcase now open, and a tablet in hand. Maya clung to Mrs. Barrow's side, her small frame tense and her eyes wary. "I understand this might be difficult," Miss Calder said, her tone measured. "But I need to conduct an initial assessment. Maya's case requires careful review, and part of that involves ensuring her current placement is suitable." "She's not just a placement," Mrs. Barrow said firmly, her hand resting protectively on Maya's shoulder. "She's family." Jonathan, seated across from the social worker, frowned. Why does she have to leave it all? Her dad wanted her to be here. Ms. Calder offered a polite but guarded smile. "I understand your feelings, Jonathan, but the law requires that we explore all options, including any living biological relatives." At this, Maya's head dropped, and her grip on Mrs. Barrow's hand tightened. Jonathan's stomach knotted as he realized the implication. Someone might try to take Maya away. Later that afternoon, after Ms. Calder had left, the Barrows gathered in the living room to discuss what lay ahead. Mr. Barrow sat in his recliner, his posture straight but his face lined with worry. "We'll need to go through the proper legal channels to apply for guardianship," he explained. "It's not going to be easy, but it's the only way to make sure Maya stays with us." "What happens if someone else wants her?" Maya asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She was sitting on the couch next to Jonathan, her knees drawn up to her chest. Mr. Barrow hesitated, his expression pained. "If a biological relative steps forward and petitions for custody, the court will likely prioritize them." "But they don't even know her," Jonathan burst out, unable to contain his frustration. "How can they say they care when they've never been here for her?" "They don't care," Maya murmured. "They just want what comes with me." The room fell silent. Mrs. Barrow reached for Maya's hand, squeezing it gently. "Sweetheart, we won't let that happen. We'll fight for you. Your father trusted us to keep you safe, and that's exactly what we'll do." In the days that followed, the Barrows began preparing for what felt like a battle. Jonathan watched as his parents worked late into the night, poring over legal forms and gathering every piece of evidence they could find to support their case. Report cards, photos, and even notes from Maya's teachers and neighbors were compiled into neat folders. Jonathan found himself wanting to do more. One afternoon, while Maya was busy reading in her room, he grabbed his bike and pedaled to the local community center. The woman at the front desk, Miss Clara, greeted him warmly. "Jonathan, what brings you here?" "I need help," he said, breathless from the ride. "It's about Maya." Miss Clara listened as Jonathan explained the situation, her expression growing more serious with each word. "Maya's been such a sweet girl since she started coming to the library," she said. "I've seen her helping the younger kids during story time. What do you need from me?" "Anything that shows how much she's a part of our community," Jonathan said. "Letters, photos, anything." Miss Clara nodded. I can write a letter and ask some of the other volunteers to do the same. Leave it to me." The community rallied around the Barrow family in ways Jonathan hadn't expected. Letters poured in from neighbors, teachers, and even people who had only met Maya once or twice but had been touched by her kindness. The librarian submitted a detailed letter about Maya's participation in reading programs, while the Sunday school teacher contributed a glowing testimonial about her gentle nature with younger children. Jonathan, inspired by their efforts, decided to start his own project. He gathered photos of Maya from their time together, building blanket forts, playing basketball, and even the goofy selfies they'd taken on a lazy Sunday afternoon. With help from Mrs. Barrow, he created a scrapbook titled Maya's Family and Friends. The day of the first court hearing arrived with a sense of quiet tension. The Barrows dressed in their best clothes, and Maya wore a simple dress with her hair neatly braided. Jonathan noticed how she clutched the silver star pendant around her neck, her knuckles white from the pressure. At the courthouse, they were surprised to find several familiar faces waiting to support them. Miss Clara stood with a folder of letters, and Mrs. Chen, their elderly neighbor, held a framed photo of Maya helping her in the garden. Even Jonathan's best friend, Tommy, was there with his parents, holding a sign that read, "Maya belongs here." Inside the courtroom, the judge listened intently as Mr. Barrow spoke about his promise to Maya's father. "Richard Thompson wasn't just my partner," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "He was my brother in every way that mattered. I made a vow to him to protect his daughter, and I intend to keep it." The judge then turned to Maya, her gaze softening. "Maya, do you feel safe with the Barrow family?" Maya hesitated, her small voice barely audible as she said, "They're my home." When the judge announced that a final decision would require further review, the Barrows left the courtroom with mixed emotions. The fight wasn't over, but they hadn't lost yet either. That evening, as they gathered around the dinner table, Jonathan looked at Maya and smiled. "We're not giving up," he said. "Not ever." Maya nodded, a small but genuine smile spreading across her face. For the first time in a long while, hope flickered in her eyes. The road ahead might be uncertain, but they would face it together, because family, as the Barrows had shown her, was worth fighting for. The battle for belonging. The days following the initial court hearing were a whirlwind of activity. Papers needed signing, more evidence had to be collected, and the Barrow family worked tirelessly to ensure Maya's place in their home remained undisputed. Despite the looming uncertainty, they refused to let fear overshadow their daily lives. For Maya, life with the Barrows had started to feel like a delicate bubble of safety, a bubble she was terrified might burst. Though the family never openly discussed their worries in front of her, she could sense the tension in the way Mrs. Barrow's voice quavered when she reassured her, or how Mr. Barrow would spend hours in his study, flipping through documents with a furrowed brow. Jonathan, however, made it his personal mission to keep Maya's spirits up. He roped her into games of basketball in the driveway, taught her how to ride a skateboard, and even started helping her with a scrapbook project they titled Maya's Story. Each page featured drawings, photographs, and snippets of happy moments she'd shared with the Barrows. "You're part of this family," Jonathan said one evening as they sat cross-legged on the living room floor, flipping through their growing scrapbook. "No judge or lawyer can change that." Maya gave him a shy smile, but doubt lingered in her eyes. "What if they don't believe us? What if they send me back?" Jonathan placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice firm. "Then we'll fight harder. You don't give up on family." The Barrows weren't the only ones fighting for Maya. Unbeknownst to her, the entire community had rallied to her cause. Letters of support continued pouring in, so many that the Barrows needed a second filing cabinet to store them all. The local librarian, Miss Clara, organized a town meeting to share Maya's story. Over 50 people attended, including teachers, neighbors, and even the owner of the corner store, where Maya often bought her favorite strawberry candies. Each person had a story to tell about how Maya had brightened their lives, no matter how small the interaction. She helped me with my groceries every week," Mrs. Chen said tearfully during the meeting, holding up a photo of Maya kneeling in her garden. "My arthritis makes it hard to carry things, but Maya never let me struggle." Even the crossing guard, Mr. Wilson, contributed his voice. "Maya's the kind of kid who thanks me every single day, rain or shine," he said, his gruff tone softening. "She's special." As the second court date loomed closer, the tension in the Barrow household reached its peak. One evening after dinner, Mr. Barrow called the family together in the living room. Maya sat on the couch, clutching her silver star pendant, while Jonathan perched on the armrest beside her. "We need to talk about tomorrow," Mr. Barrow began, his tone gentle but serious. "The hearing will focus on what's best for Maya. That means we need to be honest about everything. What it's been like living together, how we've grown as a family, and why we believe Maya belongs here." Maya looked down at her lap, her fingers tracing the edges of the pendant. What if they don't think I belong?" she asked softly. Mrs. Barrow knelt in front of her, taking both of Maya's hands in her own. "Maya, listen to me," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "You are as much a part of this family as Jonathan. No matter what happens tomorrow, that won't change." Jonathan leaned closer, nudging her gently. "And if they try to take you away, we'll just bring you back." Maya managed a small laugh, though tears shimmered in her eyes. "You promise?" "Promise," Jonathan said without hesitation. The courtroom was packed the next day. Maya sat between Mrs. Barrow and Jonathan, her small hands clutching her foster mother's tightly. Across the aisle sat her Aunt Denise, who had recently come forward to petition for custody. Dressed in a sharp suit, Denise looked every bit the picture of competence, but her expression was cold and detached. Maya couldn't bring herself to meet her aunt's eyes. The judge, a stern-looking woman with graying hair, began by reviewing the evidence presented by both sides. The Barrows' lawyer, Mr. Peterson, stood to deliver his opening statement. "Your Honor, the Barrow family has provided Maya with a stable, loving home, a place where she has not only thrived, but has become an integral part of her community. We have evidence of her academic achievements, letters from neighbors attesting to her kindness, and testimonials from teachers who have seen her transformation." Denise's lawyer countered with arguments about blood ties and legal precedents. "While we respect the Barrows' contributions, the law prioritizes biological relatives," she said, gesturing to Denise. "Ms. Denise Watson is fully capable of providing Maya with a home." When Denise took the stand, she spoke in clipped, businesslike tones. "I'm her aunt," she said simply. "Family belongs with family." Maya winced at the words, her grip on Mrs. Barrow's hand tightening. Jonathan shot her a reassuring glance, his expression one of quiet determination. When it was Mr. Barrow's turn to speak, he approached the stand with a photograph in hand. It was the same picture of him and Richard Thompson from their police academy days. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "This is a photograph of me and Maya's father, Richard. We weren't just colleagues. We were brothers in every way that mattered. Richard saved my life on more than one occasion. When he asked me to promise that I'd look after his daughter if anything happened to him, I gave him my word. It wasn't just a promise between friends. It was a commitment between brothers." He held up the photograph for the courtroom to see, his eyes locking with the judge's. "Maya is more than a promise to us. She's family. And family isn't just about blood. It's about love, trust, and standing by each other through everything." The courtroom was silent as Mr. Barrow returned to his seat. Maya looked up at him, her eyes wide with gratitude. The judge called a brief recess before delivering her ruling. The wait felt agonizingly long, but the Barrows stayed close, surrounding Maya with their quiet support. Finally, the judge returned, her expression unreadable. She adjusted her glasses and began to speak. After careful consideration of all evidence presented, including the overwhelming support from the community and Maya's own testimony, this court finds that the best interests of the child lie with the Barrow family. Maya's breath caught in her throat. The judge continued, "The Barrows have demonstrated an exceptional ability to provide a stable, loving home where Maya has thrived emotionally, academically, and socially. Custody is hereby awarded to Robert and Sarah Barrow." The gavel came down with a sharp crack, and the room erupted in applause. Maya turned to the Barrows, tears streaming down her face as she threw her arms around Mrs. Barrow. "We did it," Jonathan whispered, his own voice thick with emotion. "You're home, Maya. For good." That night, the Barrows celebrated with Maya's favorite dinner, mac and cheese with extra breadcrumbs. As they laughed and shared stories around the table, Maya felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time, a profound sense of belonging. For the first time, she truly believed that this was her family, not just in name, but in every way that mattered. And as she drifted off to sleep in her room, her permanent room, she clutched her star pendant tightly, knowing that she had finally found her place in the world. Building forever. Life in the Barrow household settled into a comforting rhythm after the court's decision. For the first time in what felt like forever, Maya woke each morning without the lingering fear of being uprooted. Her room became her sanctuary, filled with books, drawings, and little trinkets Jonathan had given her over the months. She painted the walls a soft lavender, her favorite color, with the help of the entire family. Even Mr. Barrow joined in, though he joked about needing to arrest someone after dripping paint on the carpet. It wasn't just the Barrow family who welcomed Maya home. The entire community embraced her in ways that left her both humbled and overwhelmed. Letters from neighbors continued to arrive, not out of necessity for the custody case, but simply because people wanted to show their support. Mrs. Chen stopped by one afternoon with freshly baked cookies, insisting Maya deserved a proper welcome. "You've got quite the village behind you, young lady," Mrs. Chen said, her voice warm as she handed Maya a plate of snickerdoodles. "Don't forget that." Maya threw herself into her new life with enthusiasm, determined to make the most of her second chance. At school, she excelled in her classes, her confidence growing with each passing day. Her teachers, who had initially described her as shy and withdrawn, now spoke of her as a bright and engaged student. She joined the school's art club, where she discovered a passion for painting. Under the guidance of her art teacher, Mrs. Alvarez, Maya began creating pieces that reflected not only her talent but also her journey. One painting, a vibrant depiction of a star shining through a stormy sky, earned her first place in the county art competition. When asked about its inspiration, Maya simply smiled and said, "It's about finding light, even in the darkest times." Jonathan, ever the proud older brother, made sure everyone knew about her achievement. "She's the best artist in the school," he bragged to his friends, holding up a flyer with her winning painting. Maya blushed at his praise, but secretly cherished his unwavering support. Though Maya's days were filled with new adventures, her nights often brought memories of the past. Sometimes she would wake from dreams of her father, his voice echoing softly in her mind. He was always smiling in those dreams, his hand resting on her shoulder as he whispered words of encouragement. One evening, as she sat on the porch watching the sunset, Jonathan joined her. He handed her a soda and plopped down beside her, his skateboard resting against the railing. "You've been quiet today," he observed, taking the sip from his own drink. Maya fiddled with the silver star pendant around her neck, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "I was thinking about my dad," she admitted. "He would have loved it here." Jonathan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "He'd be proud of you, you know. You've been through so much, and you're still standing strong." Maya glanced at him, her eyes glistening. "You think so?" "I know so," Jonathan said firmly. "And I think he'd be really happy knowing you ended up with us." Maya smiled, the kind of smile that came from deep within. A mixture of gratitude, love, and the bittersweet ache of missing someone. "Thanks, Jonathan." "Anytime, sis." The following weekend, the Barrows organized a community barbecue to celebrate not only Maya's official adoption, but also the bonds that had formed throughout the custody battle. The backyard buzzed with life as neighbors, friends, and even some of Maya's classmates gathered to share food and laughter. Maya found herself surrounded by people who had become like family. Mrs. Chin was there, offering her famous spring rolls, while Mr. Martinez manned the grill with Mr. Barrow, flipping burgers and hot dogs. Jonathan's best friend, Tommy, had brought over a box of sparklers for later, promising to teach Maya how to write her name in the air. Amid the festivities, Maya noticed a familiar figure standing near the garden. It was Miss Clara, the librarian, holding a wrapped gift. "Miss Clara," Maya exclaimed, running over to greet her. The librarian smiled warmly and handed Maya the gift. "I thought you might like this," she said. "It's something special to celebrate your new chapter." Maya carefully unwrapped the package, revealing a leather-bound journal with her name embossed on the cover. Her breath caught as she ran her fingers over the smooth surface. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice filled with awe. "Thank you. I thought you might use it to write your story," Miss Clara said. "You have a way with words, Maya. Don't let that go." As night fell, the sparklers came out, lighting up the backyard with trails of glittering light. Maya laughed as Jonathan showed her how to write her name in the air, the glowing letters fading almost as quickly as they appeared. In that moment, surrounded by her family and friends, Maya felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time. Pure, unfiltered joy. The shadows of her past hadn't disappeared, but they no longer defined her. She was part of something bigger now. A family, a community, a home. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the house had quieted, Maya sat at her desk, the new journal open in front of her. She picked up a pen and hesitated for a moment before writing the first line. "Family isn't about where you come from. It's about who stands beside you, who lifts you up when you're down, and who fights for you when you can't fight for yourself." She paused, looking around her room. The lavender walls, the twinkling fairy lights, the framed picture of the Barrows at the courthouse. It all felt so real, so permanent. Maya smiled and continued writing, her heart full of gratitude for the family who had made her feel like she truly belonged. The legacy of love. Years passed, and the Barrow household grew and evolved, but the core of their family, the unwavering bond forged through love and resilience, remained steadfast. Maya, now a poised and confident young woman, stood in her lavender room, her hands brushing the smooth surface of her star-shaped pendant. It had become her talisman, a reminder of both the father she'd lost and the family she'd gained. The day was special, bittersweet in a way. It was her high school graduation, a milestone she never thought she'd reach with such certainty and support. From the nervous girl who had once stood drenched on the Barrow's doorstep, Maya had grown into someone who embraced the world with both courage and compassion. And this day wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had helped her reach this point. The auditorium buzzed with excitement as families filed in, snapping photos and exchanging hugs. Maya sat in her cap and gown, her fingers nervously tracing the edges of her valedictorian speech. Her name had been announced just a month earlier, a decision met with applause and cheers from her classmates. Jonathan, now a college sophomore, sat in the front row with Mr. and Mrs. Barrow, their faces beaming with pride. Mrs. Chin was there too, along with Miss Clara and a handful of neighbors who had become more like extended family. When it was time for Maya to speak, she walked to the podium, her heart pounding in her chest. The sea of faces in the crowd blurred slightly as she took a deep breath, gripping the edges of the lectern. "Good afternoon, everyone," she began, her voice steady despite the swirl of emotions in her chest. "Today, as we celebrate this milestone in our lives, I want to share a story. It's not just my story. It's the story of family, resilience, and the people who change our lives in ways we never expect." The crowd grew silent, her words carrying weight beyond the typical graduation platitudes. Maya spoke of her father, the kind and selfless man who had given her a foundation of love. She described the pain of losing him and the fear of being alone, only to find herself standing on the doorstep of a family who would change her life forever. "I was scared," she admitted, her voice cracking slightly. But the Barrows didn't see a stranger. They saw a little girl who needed a home, a family, and hope. And they gave me all of that. And more. She glanced at the Barrows, tears glistening in her eyes. "To Mom and Dad," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "Thank you for loving me, even when it wasn't easy. Thank you for fighting for me when I didn't know how to fight for myself. And Jonathan," she added, her gaze shifting to her brother, "thank you for always being there, for teaching me to laugh again, and for reminding me every day that family isn't about where you're born. It's about who you choose to love." The applause that followed was thunderous, but Maya barely heard it. She returned to her seat, her heart full as she realized how far she had come, and how many people had helped her along the way. That evening, the Barrow home was filled with laughter and celebration. Friends, neighbors, and family gathered to honor Maya's achievements, but more importantly, to celebrate the bond that had brought them all together. Jonathan stood by the grill, flipping burgers and joking with his friends, while Mrs. Barrow set out plates of Maya's favorite foods. Mr. Barrow held court near the back patio, sharing stories about Maya's childhood with anyone who would listen. "She used to be so shy," he said, laughing as he recounted the time Maya had accidentally called him Uncle Robert during a school event. "Now look at her, valedictorian, artist, and future college student. She's amazing." Later that night, after the guests had left and the house had quieted, Maya and Jonathan sat on the back porch, just as they had so many years ago. The stars above were bright, and the air was cool and still. "What's next for you, valedictorian?" Jonathan teased, nudging her shoulder. Maya smiled, her fingers brushing the silver pendant around her neck. "College first," she said. "And then, I want to make a difference. I want to help kids like me find families who'll love them the way you all loved me." Jonathan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You're going to be amazing at that." Maya tilted her head toward him, her smile widening. "You really think so?" "Absolutely," he said without hesitation. "You're a Barrow. We don't quit." The years continued to roll by, and Maya's dream of helping others became a reality. She graduated college with honors and began working as a social worker, dedicating her life to ensuring that no child felt the loneliness and fear she once had. Her work took her to courtrooms, foster homes, and schools, where she became an advocate for children who needed a voice. Maya's story didn't just inspire those she worked with, it became a legacy. The scrapbook she and Jonathan had created during their childhood became a centerpiece in her office, a tangible reminder of how far she had come. Whenever she faced a difficult case, she would glance at it and remember the family who had fought for her. One day, as she stood before a group of foster parents, training them on how to create nurturing environments for children in their care, she saw a familiar face in the crowd. It was Mrs. Barrow, her hair now streaked with gray, but her smile just as warm as ever. After the session, Mrs. Barrow approached her, pulling her into a tight hug. "You've made us so proud, sweetheart," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Your father would be so proud too." Maya felt tears welling up but managed to smile through them. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." "You didn't just survive, Maya," Mrs. Barrow said, cupping her cheek gently. "You've thrived, and you've given back more than we ever dreamed." That night, as Maya returned home, she sat on her bed and opened her old journal. Flipping through its worn pages, she stopped at the first line she had ever written. "Family isn't about where you come from. It's about who stands beside you, who lifts you up when you're down, and who fights for you when you can't fight for yourself." She smiled, closing the journal and holding it to her chest. Her family had given her everything she needed to grow, and now it was her turn to do the same for others. As she drifted off to sleep, the silver star pendant resting on her nightstand caught the light, casting a gentle glow across the room. It was a reminder of the journey she had taken, and the legacy of love she would carry forward forever. The full circle. The years unfolded like pages in a cherished book, and Maya's life became a testament to resilience and love. Now in her early 30s, Maya had built a life that blended her passion for helping others with her own personal happiness. She lived in a cozy house not far from the Barrow family, its walls adorned with artwork she had painted over the years, pieces that reflected her journey from despair to hope. Her work as a social worker had brought her into contact with countless children, each one reminding her in some way of the girl she once was, scared, uncertain, yet desperate for love. Maya had made it her mission to be a beacon of light for those children, just as the Barrows had been for her. One crisp autumn morning, Maya received a call from Jonathan, who was now married and expecting his first child. "Hey, sis," Jonathan said, his voice warm and teasing. "Are you ready to become an aunt?" Maya laughed, her heart swelling with excitement. "You know I've been ready since the day you told me. Is Ella feeling okay?" "She's great," Jonathan replied, "though she's insisting that you're going to spoil the baby rotten." "Well, she's not wrong," Maya said with a grin. "You'd better save me a spot at the hospital when the time comes." "You'll be first in line," Jonathan promised. As she hung up, Maya couldn't help but reflect on how much her life had changed. The girl who once believed she had no future was now preparing to welcome her first niece or nephew into the world, a testament to the love and stability the Barrows had given her. Later that week, Maya visited the Barrow house for their annual family dinner. The house was as warm and welcoming as ever, the scent of Mrs. Barrow's famous pot roast wafting through the air. Mr. Barrow was in the living room, watching an old Western movie, while Mrs. Barrow fussed over the table settings. "Maya, sweetheart, can you help me with the rolls?" Mrs. Barrow called from the kitchen. "Of course, Mom," Maya replied, slipping into the role that had become second nature to her. As they worked together, Mrs. Barrow glanced at her with a tender smile. "You've been busy these days, haven't you?" Maya nodded. "Work's been intense, but it's worth it. There's this little boy I've been working with. His name's Ethan. He reminds me so much of myself when I first came here." Mrs. Barrow's smile grew. "And you're going to help him find his family, aren't you?" "I hope so," Maya said, her voice soft. "He deserves that chance." The conversation lingered in Maya's mind as the evening went on. As she sat at the dinner table, surrounded by the people who had given her a home, she realized how much she wanted to offer that same kind of belonging to someone else. It wasn't just about her work. It was about paying forward the love she had received. That night, as she drove home, an idea began to take root. By the time she pulled into her driveway, she had made a decision that filled her with both excitement and nervous anticipation. A month later, Maya sat in a brightly lit office, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Across the desk, a caseworker reviewed her application with a thoughtful expression. "You're sure about this?" the caseworker asked, glancing up at her. "Adoption is a big step, especially as a single parent." Maya nodded, her voice steady. "I've never been more sure of anything. I know what it feels like to be a child in the system, wondering if anyone will love you enough to keep you. I don't want Ethan, or any child, to feel that way." The caseworker smiled. "You've got a strong application. Your background as a social worker and your personal story both speak volumes. I'll move forward with the next steps." As Maya left the office, a mix of nerves and determination coursed through her. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she also knew it was the right one. Ethan was 7 years old, a quiet boy with big brown eyes and a cautious demeanor. Maya had met him through her work, and over time, she had built a bond with him. He had opened up to her in small ways, sharing stories about his favorite books and his dreams of becoming an astronaut. When Maya told him she wanted to be his forever family, his eyes widened in disbelief. "Really?" he whispered. "You mean I could live with you? For real?" "For real," Maya said, her voice filled with emotion. "You'd have your own room, and we'd make it just the way you like, and you'd never have to wonder where you belong." Tears filled Ethan's eyes as he nodded. I'd like that. The adoption process was long and filled with hurdles, but Maya faced each one with the unwavering support of the Barrow family. They attended court hearings, helped prepare Ethan's new room, and showered him with love even before he officially became part of the family. When the day of the finalization hearing arrived, Ethan stood in front of the judge holding Maya's hand tightly. "Do you want to be part of Maya's family?" the judge asked gently. Ethan nodded, his voice clear and certain. "Yes." The gavel came down, and the room erupted into cheers. Ethan turned to Maya, his eyes shining with happiness. "I have a family now," he said softly. "You always did," Maya replied, pulling him into a hug. That evening, the Barrows hosted another celebration, this time in honor of Ethan. The backyard was filled with laughter and light as Ethan ran around with Jonathan's young daughter, the two of them giggling as they chased fireflies. Maya stood by the grill with Mr. Barrow, her heart full as she watched her son, play with the same joy she had once thought impossible. "You've come full circle, sweetheart," Mr. Barrow said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Your dad would be so proud of you." Maya looked up at him, her eyes brimming with tears. "I wouldn't be here without you and Mom. You showed me what family really means." "And now you're doing the same for Ethan," Mr. Barrow said with a smile. "That's what it's all about." As the evening wound down, Maya sat on the porch swing with Ethan, the two of them wrapped in a blanket as they looked up at the stars. Ethan held a small telescope Jonathan had given him as a gift, pointing out constellations with excitement. "Do you think I'll ever go to space?" Ethan asked, his voice filled with wonder. Maya smiled, her heart swelling with love. "I think you can do anything you set your mind to, and I'll be right here cheering you on." Ethan leaned against her, his small hand resting in hers. "I love you, Mom." Tears welled up in Maya's eyes as she held him close. "I love you too, Ethan, more than you'll ever know." As they sat together under the vast expanse of the night sky, Maya felt a profound sense of peace. The journey that had begun on a rainy evening so many years ago had led her to this moment, a moment filled with love, family, and the knowledge that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Generations of love. The years that followed Ethan's adoption unfolded with an almost poetic sense of continuity. Maya, now a seasoned social worker and mother, had built a life that radiated warmth, purpose, and love. Her home, a cheerful house filled with books, art, and laughter, became a sanctuary for her growing family and a hub for the community she had always cherished. Ethan was no longer the quiet, cautious boy she had first met. Now 13, he was a vibrant, curious young man with a fascination for science and a knack for making everyone laugh. His room was a testament to his interests, with shelves filled with books on astronomy, posters of galaxies, and models of rockets scattered across his desk. One rainy Saturday afternoon, Maya and Ethan were seated at the kitchen table, working on a model spaceship for his science project. The sound of the rain against the windows brought back memories for Maya, and she found herself pausing, her hands resting on a tiny tube of glue. "Mom." Ethan's voice pulled her back to the present. "You okay?" She smiled, ruffling his hair. "I'm fine, just thinking about how far we've come." Ethan tilted his head, his brown eyes curious. "You mean, like, me and you?" Maya nodded. "Me, you, Uncle Jonathan, Grandpa Robert, Grandma Sarah, all of us. This family, this life we've built, it's everything I once thought I'd never have." Ethan leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Is that why you're always saying family first, whenever I leave my shoes all over the house?" Maya burst out laughing, the sound filling the kitchen with joy. "Yes, and it's also why I don't ground you when you leave those science experiments bubbling over in the sink." Later that evening, the Barrow family gathered at Jonathan's house to celebrate Mr. and Mrs. Barrow's 40th wedding anniversary. The house was buzzing with activity as children played in the yard, neighbors mingled, and the smell of barbecue wafted through the air. Maya stood in the living room, holding a glass of sparkling cider and watching her parents, slow dance to an old love song. Mr. Barrow's hair was now silver, and Mrs. Barrow moved a little more slowly than she used to. But their love was as strong as ever. "They're incredible, aren't they?" Jonathan said, appearing beside her. He held his toddler daughter, Grace, who clutched a stuffed bunny, and babbled happily. Maya nodded, her eyes misting. "They're everything. If it weren't for them." Jonathan nudged her gently. "Hey, don't get all weepy on me now. You're making me look bad." Maya laughed, wiping her eyes. "You're still the same annoying brother, you know that. And you're still the little sister who stole my comic books," Jonathan teased, grinning. "Speaking of which, Ethan is starting to remind me of you. The kid's got the same spark." Maya's smile softened as she glanced toward the yard, where Ethan was explaining the phases of the moon to a group of younger kids. "He's incredible," she said. "I just want to give him everything Dad and Mom gave us." Jonathan placed a hand on her shoulder. "You already have, and you're raising him to do the same for others. That's the legacy." As the evening wore on, Maya and Ethan found themselves sitting on the back porch swing, watching the stars. The night sky was clear, and the air was cool, carrying the scent of the flowers Mrs. Barrow had planted decades ago. "Grandpa told me he used to look at the stars with your dad," Ethan said, breaking the silence. "Did you do that with him too?" Maya nodded, her gaze fixed on the twinkling sky. "He taught me how to find constellations. He always said that even on the darkest nights, there's light to guide you. It's why I wear this." She touched the silver star pendant around her neck, its surface worn smooth from years of wear. Ethan was quiet for a moment, then leaned back, his hands behind his head. "You know what I think." "What's that?" Maya asked, glancing at him. "I think you're like a star, Mom. You've been my light through everything." Maya's breath caught, and she turned away, blinking back tears. "Ethan," she said softly, "you're the brightest part of my world. You've given me a reason to keep going, to keep believing in the power of family." Over the next few years, Maya's work expanded beyond her role as a social worker. She started a nonprofit organization called Forever Families, dedicated to supporting foster children and their caregivers. The organization provided resources, counseling, and mentorship programs, many of which were inspired by her own experiences. Ethan, now a high school senior, volunteered with the organization, sharing his story with younger kids and helping them navigate their own journeys. He had inherited Maya's compassion and drive, and it showed in everything he did. One afternoon, as Maya was reviewing a grant proposal in her office, Ethan walked in holding a large envelope. His expression was a mix of excitement and nervousness. "What's that?" Maya asked, setting aside her paperwork. Ethan handed her the envelope. "College acceptance letter. You want to open it with me?" Maya's heart raced as she carefully tore open the envelope. Inside was a letter from the university Ethan had dreamed of attending, a prestigious school with a renowned astronomy program. "Dear Mr. Thompson," she read aloud, her voice trembling, "we are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted into the class of 20XX. Ethan whooped, pulling her into a hug. "I did it, Mom." Maya laughed through her tears, holding him tightly. "I'm so proud of you, Ethan. Your dad would be too." The day Ethan left for college was bittersweet. The entire Barrow family gathered to see him off, filling his car with bags, books, and snacks for the road. Maya hugged him tightly, her voice breaking as she said, "Don't forget to call. And remember, no matter where you go, you'll always have a home here." Ethan grinned. "I know, Mom. Family first, right?" "Always," Maya said, wiping her eyes as she watched him drive away. Years later, Ethan returned home, not as a student, but as a young man with dreams of working for NASA. He brought with him a sense of purpose that reminded Maya of her own journey. Together, they sat in the living room, flipping through the old scrapbook she and Jonathan had created so many years ago. This is where it all started, Ethan said, pointing to a page filled with childhood drawings. Our family. Our story. Maya nodded, her heart full. And it's only the beginning, Ethan. There's so much more to come. As they sat together, the silver star pendant glinting softly in the light, Maya realized that the love that had once saved her had become a legacy, one that would shine brightly for generations to come. The legacy expands. Maya stood in the center of a large conference hall, her voice steady as she addressed a crowd of foster parents, social workers, and former foster children. The annual conference for her nonprofit, Forever Families, had grown over the years, transforming from a small local gathering to a nationally recognized event. Family, Maya said, her voice resonating with conviction, is not defined by blood or circumstance. It's defined by love, by the choice to stand by someone no matter what. That's what saved me, and that's what we're here to offer every child in the system. The audience erupted into applause, but Maya's gaze lingered on one face in particular, Ethan's. Now a recent college graduate, he had taken a more active role in the organization, heading initiatives to connect older foster children with mentorship programs. When the session ended, Ethan approached her with a warm smile. "You're still the best at this," he said, holding out a bottle of water. Maya took it with a laugh. "Thanks, but I think you're catching up. That last panel you ran was incredible." Ethan shrugged, his humility shining through as always. "I learned from the best." Maya glanced around the bustling conference hall, filled with people whose lives had been touched by her work. She thought of her father, Richard, whose promise had set this entire journey in motion, and of the Barrows, whose love had made it all possible. That evening, Maya and Ethan returned home to prepare for a family dinner at the Barrows' house. The familiar scent of lavender from her childhood room greeted Maya as she entered, now repurposed into a cozy guest room for her frequent visits. As she set down her bag, she noticed a new addition to the room, a framed photo of herself and Ethan, taken on the day of this college graduation. In the photo, Maya was laughing, her arm wrapped around Ethan's shoulders as he held up his diploma. The sight of it filled her with warmth. Ethan appeared in the doorway, holding a garment bag. "Do you think Grandpa will notice if I wear the same tie I wore last year?" he asked with a grin. Maya smirked. "He'll notice, and he'll say something. You know how Grandpa Robert is." Ethan chuckled. "Better find a new one." Then, the Barrows' home was just as lively as ever. Jonathan and his wife, Ella, were chasing their two kids, Grace and her younger brother, Liam, around the yard. Mr. Barrow manned the grill, while Mrs. Barrow supervised from her favorite chair on the porch, sipping iced tea. "Look who's here," Jonathan called, waving as Maya and Ethan arrived. The kids ran up to greet them, Grace tugging on Maya's arm. Aunt Maya, she exclaimed. "I finished my drawing. Come see." Maya let herself be dragged inside, where Grace proudly displayed a crayon drawing of their family. It featured everyone: Mr. and Mrs. Barrow, Jonathan and Ella, the kids, Ethan, and Maya herself. "You even remembered Grandpa's hat," Maya said, pointing to the tiny detail. "This is amazing, Grace." Grace beamed. "You can keep it if you want." Maya accepted the drawing with a heartfelt smile. "I'd love to." Dinner that night was a feast as always. Mr. Barrow shared stories from his days on the police force, while Jonathan kept everyone laughing with his exaggerated tales of life with two kids under 6. After dessert, as the evening wound down, Maya found herself sitting on the porch swing with Mrs. Barrow. The older woman's hair had turned completely silver, but her eyes still held the same warmth that had comforted Maya on her first night with the family. "You've built something remarkable, Maya," Mrs. Barrow said, her voice soft but filled with pride. "Your dad would be over the moon." Maya glanced out at the yard, where Ethan was helping Mr. Barrow clean up. "I owe it all to you and Dad. If you hadn't taken me in, I don't even want to think about where I'd be." Mrs. Barrow reached over, taking Maya's hand in hers. You were always meant to be part of this family. We just gave you the space to grow into who you were meant to be." Maya swallowed the lump in her throat. "I hope I've made you proud." Mrs. Barrow smiled, her grip firm but gentle. "You've made us prouder than you'll ever know." The next day, Maya and Ethan met at the Forever Family's office to finalize plans for a new initiative, a scholarship fund for foster youth pursuing higher education. They were naming it the Richard Thompson Scholarship, in honor of Maya's father. "This is going to change lives," Ethan said as they reviewed the applications. Maya nodded. "It's more than a scholarship. It's a promise to every kid out there who feels like they don't have a shot. We're telling them they do." As they worked, a knock at the door interrupted their conversation. A young girl, no older than 8, peeked inside, holding the hand of a social worker. "This is Kayla," the social worker said. "She's interested in joining the mentoring program." Maya knelt to Kayla's level, offering her a warm smile. "Hi, Kayla. I'm Maya. Do you like art? Books? Science?" Kayla hesitated, then whispered, "Books." Maya's smile widened. "We got lots of books here. Maybe Ethan can show you the library while I talk to your caseworker." Ethan held out his hand, his voice kind and reassuring. "Come on, Kayla. I'll show you my favorite ones." As they walked away, Maya felt a surge of hope. This was why she did what she did, not just for Ethan or herself, but for every child searching for a place to belong. That evening, Maya sat at her desk, adding the final touches to the scrapbook she had started all those years ago with Jonathan. The pages now included photos of Ethan's adoption day, his college graduation, and even the new family portrait Grace had drawn. As she closed the book, she placed it on the shelf beside a framed photo of her father. The silver star pendant rested on the desk, its surface catching the light. She held it for a moment, her fingers tracing its edges. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered, "for believing in me, for trusting the Barrows, for setting all of this in motion." Maya placed the pendant back on the desk, her heart full. The legacy of love her father had started, and the Barrows had nurtured, was stronger than ever. And as long as she had breath, she would continue to carry it forward, one child, one family, one act of kindness at a time.